2:18 p.m. A supercar factory in northern Italy. Inside the engine testing bay, a prototype hypercar worth $2 million roared, its thunderous vibrations shaking the facility's foundations. Engineers stared at digital monitors in absolute disbelief. Efficiency was up 16%. Thermal stability was perfect. Alessandra Vieri, the 36-year-old CEO, stared at the schematics, her eyes narrowed with intensity. She turned to the room and asked, "Who designed this engine revision?" Silence followed. In the corner, an 8-year-old girl waiting for her father's shift to end raised her hand. "My dad did." The entire room turned. The father was just a maintenance mechanic. He saw. Marco Bellini was a man who spoke the language of cold steel and hot oil. At 42, his face was etched with the quiet, weary pride of a man who worked with his hands. For 9 years, he had walked the concrete floors of this legendary Italian supercar plant. He wasn't the man with the Ivy League degree or the one sitting in the glass-walled design office with a view of the rolling Modena hills. Marco was a maintenance technician. He was the one they called when a prototype failed. The one who took the engines apart to see where the fire had gone wrong and why the expensive dreams of engineers had turned into piles of smoking metal. Marco understood engines. He didn't just see them as data points on a CAD program. He heard them as heartbeats. He knew the way metal expanded under the brutal heat of a V8, and he knew the precise, rhythmic click of a perfectly timed valve. He could tell if a cylinder was misfiring just by feeling the vibration through the soles of his work boots. But his life was more than just torque and gears. Marco was a single father, a widower who had lost his wife Maria in a tragic car accident 4 years ago. Since then, the world had shrunk down to his daughter, Giulia. At 8 years old, Giulia was his shadow. Because Marco often worked late-night maintenance shifts to pay off the remaining family debts and hospital bills, Giulia would sit in the corner of the technical break room, surrounded by the heavy smell of diesel and the distant, rhythmic whine of pneumatic tools. She would do her homework, sketching cars that looked like they were made of clouds and stardust. The factory was currently in the middle of its most ambitious project, the Vieri Hyperion. It was meant to be the pinnacle of hybrid technology, a V8 hybrid engine that would redefine the industry and save the company from financial ruin. But the project was bleeding money. The prototypes were plagued with 2 fatal flaws that no computer model could solve. They would hit critical overheating levels after just 20 minutes of high-load running, and they developed a violent, bone-shaking vibration at high RPMs that threatened to tear the carbon fiber chassis apart. The design engineers, men in expensive lab coats and even more expensive shoes, had run thousands of simulations. They had redesigned the fuel injectors. They had swapped the alloy composition. They had even brought in outside consultants from aerospace firms. But every real-world test ended the same way, with thick white smoke, red warning lights screaming, and the heavy, suffocating weight of failure. Marco watched it all from the pit. As a maintenance man, he was the ghost in the system. He was the one who had to clean up the engine bays after the official tests failed. He saw what the blueprints didn't show because he touched the parts while they were still hot. He noticed that the airflow wasn't just insufficient. It was being blocked by the very sensors meant to monitor it. He saw the way the vibration started not in the crankshaft, but in a tiny overlooked gap in the mounting bracket that only revealed itself under extreme thermal expansion. He didn't write a formal report. In a world of high-level engineering and corporate hierarchy, no one listened to a man in blue-collar overalls who smelled like a garage. But Marco had a habit of being thorough. During his long, lonely graveyard shifts, he began making small, pencil-drawn notes in the margins of the master blueprints he found left on the grease-stained workbenches. He was just a mechanic fixing a machine. But in his heart, he was finally finishing the masterpiece Maria would have been proud of. He didn't want fame. He didn't want a promotion. He just wanted the engine to sing. The night shifts in the Modena Valley were always quiet, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans and the distant, haunting tolling of old church bells. During one particularly frustrating week for the design team, Marco found himself alone with the Revision 4 block. The engineers had left the factory at 9 p.m. their faces masks of utter defeat. The project was on the verge of being canceled by the board. Marco stood before the machine, a flashlight in his hand. He had been thinking about the cooling path for days. What if the air isn't pushed? He whispered to the empty, echoing room. What if it's pulled through the heart? Nearby, a junior engineer named Luca had stayed late to file paperwork and avoid the morning's inevitable lecture from the board. He walked past the testing bay and saw Marco staring at the casing with the intensity of a doctor examining a patient. "What do you think, Marco?" Luca asked, his voice dripping with exhaustion and a touch of sarcasm. "Should we just throw the whole thing in the river and start a bakery?" Marco didn't laugh. He looked at the young man with a terrifyingly clear gaze. "What if the cooling path is redirected, Luca? Just by 4 degrees. Look at the housing. The air is hitting the turbo manifold and swirling back into the block. It's a heat trap. It's breathing its own fire." Luca, too tired to argue and desperate for any new perspective, shrugged his shoulders. "The simulations say it's fine, but the simulations aren't the ones melting on the stand. Make a note on the test sheet, Marco. I'll pretend to read it tomorrow." Marco didn't just make a note. Using the precision tools he had kept from his younger days, relics of a university life he had to leave behind, he performed a surgical adjustment. He didn't redesign the engine. He simply fine-tuned it, refined the way the air moved through the heart of the machine. He adjusted the angle of the cooling vanes and repositioned a secondary thermal sensor by less than half an inch. He moved the turbocharger bypass valve just enough to allow the heat to escape through the rear diffuser instead of baking the battery pack. It was a tiny change. On a complex blueprint, it would look like a smudge, a mere suggestion. But in the physical world, it was the difference between life and death for the machine. Marco scribbled his logic in the margin of the technical drawing in his precise, slanted handwriting. Cooling flow redirected, vortex block cleared, vibration dampened by bracket tension. He didn't sign his name. He didn't claim the glory. He simply closed the heavy bay doors, picked up a sleeping Julia from the break room sofa, and carried her home to their small, quiet apartment. The next morning, the junior engineer implemented the smudge into the digital model, assuming it was a leftover note from a midnight brainstorm by the chief designer. He ordered a new prototype run. To the absolute shock of the entire factory, the engine didn't overheat. It ran for an hour, then 2. The temperatures stayed 11% lower than the previous record. The violent vibration that had haunted the V8 vanished into a smooth musical purr that sounded like a predator in its prime. The Hyperion wasn't just working, it is dominating your test. The test bench. News of the breakthrough reached Alessandra Vieri at the corporate headquarters in Milan. She arrived at the factory that afternoon, her heels clicking a sharp, aggressive rhythm on the concrete. She was a woman of logic, power, and incredibly high standards. She stood in the center of the bay, surrounded by her senior design team, staring at the most beautiful data curves she had ever seen in her career. "This revision is a miracle," Alessandra said, her voice echoing through the steel rafters. "The thermal stability is beyond our most optimistic projections. The 16% jump in efficiency saves the Hyperion project and this company. So tell me, who designed this? Who finally saw the cooling conflict that my $5 million software missed?" The chief designer, a man with 20 years of experience and an ego that filled the room, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, trying to sound authoritative while hiding his confusion. "It was a collective effort, Alessandra. We've been iterating on the airflow dynamics for weeks. After reviewing the previous data, we decided to implement a more aggressive cooling redirect during the last revision cycle. My team really pulled through." Alessandra wasn't a fool. She had grown up in this industry, and she knew that breakthroughs rarely came from committees. She walked to the workbench and picked up the physical blueprint. She saw the pencil marks. She saw the simple hand-drawn arrows that stood in stark contrast to the perfect digital lines of her senior staff. "Collaborative?" Alessandra repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that made the chief designer pale. "These notes weren't made by a computer. They were made by someone who knows what air actually feels like. Who wrote these notes?" Who touched this engine at 3 a.m. while the rest of you were sleeping? The room went stone-cold silent. The senior engineers looked at the floor, their faces turning various shades of red. They didn't know. They hadn't bothered to look at who was cleaning their tables or emptying their bins. Julia, sitting in the corner with her sketchbook, recognized the paper in the CEO's hand. She had seen those same arrows on the back of her napkins at dinner. She had seen her father hunched over his desk at midnight, drawing those exact shapes to explain to her how wind works. She stood up, her small voice cutting through the heavy tension of the boardroom. That's my dad's handwriting. She pointed her small finger directly at Marco, who was standing 20 feet away, trying to hide a grease-stained hand behind his back and looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Marco Bellini felt the heat of 100 stares burn into his skin. Every head in the bay, from the highest-paid engineer to the security guard at the door, turned toward him. The machine seemed to go quiet just to hear his response. He wanted to vanish. He wasn't a man who craved the spotlight. He was a man who lived in the safety of the background, finding comfort in the silence of machines. He gripped the grease-stained rag in his hands, his knuckles turning white. He shook his head slightly, a low, hesitant rumble in his chest. I only made some maintenance notes, Signora. I didn't mean to interfere with the design. I just thought, I thought it would make the block easier to service if it wasn't glowing red after every run. Alessandra Vieri didn't look at the chief designer again. She ignored the embarrassed murmurs of her staff and walked straight toward Marco. The blueprint was held in her hand like a holy relic. She didn't see the dirty uniform or the oil on his face. She looked into his eyes and saw a level of mechanical intelligence that her boardroom had been missing for years. She held up the paper, the pencil marks visible in the bright factory lights. You adjusted the fan pitch by 4.2 degrees, Marco. You moved the sensor out of the heat wake. The engineers told me this was a collective breakthrough. But this handwriting, it tells a different story. It says you're the only one who actually understood why the machine was dying. Tell me, right now, what did you see that they didn't? Marco looked at the floor, then at Julia. His daughter was watching him with wide, shimmering eyes that were full of a pride that no paycheck could ever buy. He realized he couldn't lie, not to her. He had taught her to always stand by her work. He let out a long, steady breath and stepped toward the test stand. He didn't look at the senior engineers, he looked at the engine. His hands moved instinctively over the metallic casing, tracing the lines of the air intakes with a reverence that was almost religious. It's the corner of the housing, Signora, Marco explained, his voice gaining a sudden, resonant strength. The fixer was gone. The master was speaking. The design team wanted it to look aerodynamic from the outside. They wanted it to be pretty for the marketing brochure. But inside, at high speeds, the cooling air was hitting a 90-degree dead end. It was creating a pocket of stagnant, superheated air right over the primary sensors. The computer thought the whole engine was about to melt, so it would dump excess fuel to try and cool the cylinders. But it was a feedback loop. It just made the vibration worse in the efficiency crater. He pointed to the turbos. By changing the angle of the vanes, I created a vortex. It doesn't just push the air, it pulls it through the housing. It sweeps the heat away before the sensors can panic. You didn't need a €3 million redesign. You just needed to let the engine breathe. The senior engineers stood in a semicircle of shame. Their faces were a mosaic of red, pale, and gray. They had spent millions of euros on cloud-based simulations and wind tunnel data, and a maintenance man had solved the problem with a pencil, a file, and a deep understanding of reality. Alessandra Vieri turned to her chief engineer. Her voice was a whisper that felt like thunder. Is he right? Did we miss a stagnant air pocket because we were too worried about aesthetics? The man hesitated, then he looked at the thermal readout again. He let out a long, defeated sigh. We focused on the internal combustion physics, Signora. We assumed the housing airflow was a solved variable based on the manufacturer's specs. Marco, he's absolutely right. The vortex pitch fixes the drag coefficient perfectly. Alessandra turned back to Marco. The atmosphere in the factory had shifted. It was no longer a workplace. It was a revelation. It was the moment the ice queen of the automotive world realized where her true value lay. We spent months trying to redesign what someone working beside the engine understood in days, Alessandra said, her voice ringing through the rafters for every worker to hear. We've been hiring based on degrees and titles. We've been valuing the person with the loudest voice in the room. But we stopped looking at the people who actually touch the machines every day. Marco isn't just a mechanic. He is the reason this Hyperion will ever see a road. He is the reason we still have a company. She looked at the engineers who were staring at their feet, and then she looked at Marco's humble blue-collar uniform. Marco, she said, her tone softening into a deep, genuine respect. I want you to join the engine development team, not as an assistant, as a lead consultant. This factory has been running with one ear closed. It's time we started listening to the people who know the sound of the machine. I want your hands on every engine we build from now on. She knelt down to Julia's level, ignoring the oil on the floor that stained her expensive suit. And Julia, thank you. Thank you for pointing out the truth. Your father is a very gifted man. I hope you know that he saved a lot of people's jobs today. Julia beamed, her chest puffing out with a pride that nearly brought Marco to tears. He stood there stunned as the CEO walked away. He had spent years believing that his dream of engineering was buried under a pile of bills and grief, that he was destined to be a ghost in the shadows. But in that moment, as the afternoon light faded through the high windows, the heavy weight he had been carrying for 4 long years finally began to lift. He wasn't just the man who fixed things anymore. He was the man who had seen the wind. The meeting the following morning was nothing like the reprimand Marco had feared in his nightmares. He hadn't slept a wink. He had spent the entire night worrying that he would be fired for unauthorized tampering with proprietary equipment, or that the senior engineers would find a way to discredit him. He wore his best shirt, the one with the slightly frayed collar he kept for funerals, and sat nervously on the edge of the leather chair in Alessandra's top-floor office. Alessandra Vieri wasn't looking at a spreadsheet or a legal document. She was looking at Marco's old university records, which she had requested the HR department to dig up. Why didn't you submit these ideas formally, Marco? She asked, pouring him a cup of thick, dark espresso herself. A man with your experience, a man who was top of his class in Milan before life got in the way. Why were you hiding behind a wrench? Marco looked at the steam rising from the cup. Because in a place like this, titles matter more than truth, Signora. I've seen good men get fired for being too smart for their pay grade. I needed a job that stayed stable so I could be there for Julia. I couldn't afford to be a disruptive voice. I just wanted to do my work, keep my head down, and go home to my daughter. Alessandra leaned back, a look of profound, heavy regret on her face. Then the system is broken, Marco, not just the engines. I built this company on the promise of innovation. But I realized yesterday that I had built a wall between the people who think and the people who do. I want to tear that wall down, and I want you to be the hammer. She didn't offer Marco the title of chief engineer immediately. She was too smart for that. She knew it would be a political disaster with the board and the union. Instead, she laid a heavy, embossed contract on the desk. I'm creating a new role, she said. The field to design liaison. I want you to lead it. Your job will be to sit in every single design meeting from day one. You will take the engineers' perfect digital designs, and you will find the real-world flaws before we ever cast a single ounce of steel. You will be the voice of the machine. You will be the person who reminds them that engines live in the heat, not on a screen. Marco's eyes blurred with unshed tears. I don't know what to say, Signora. Say you'll help me build cars that actually breathe. Alessandro replied with a genuine smile. And in return, the company will provide a flexible schedule so you never have to miss another of Julia's school events. I want her to see her father in the room where the decisions are made, not just in the break room. Marco felt a lump in his throat that made it hard to breathe. He thought about Maria. He thought about the 4 years of grinding struggle and the nights he felt like a failure. He picked up the pen and signed the paper with a steady hand. As Marco walked out of the executive suite, his heart lighter than it had been in years, he saw Julia sitting in the high-ceiling lobby. She was drawing in her sketchbook again, but this time, she wasn't tucked into a dark corner of a technical break room. She was sitting on a designer sofa, her feet swinging as the bright Italian sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "How did you know, Julia?" Alessandra asked, walking out with Marco to say goodbye. "How did you know those notes were his? They were just tiny marks on a huge paper." Julia didn't even look up from her page. She just pointed to a small, stylized mark at the bottom of her drawing, a tiny interlocking gear with a hidden M inside. "He draws that on my lunch bags every single day, Signora. He says it's the secret to making things move. He says if the gears don't match, the heart doesn't beat." I saw the gear on the paper. Alessandra Vieri stood there for a long time after the two of them left for breakfast. She looked at her factory from the high window, a place she thought she knew perfectly. She realized that her most valuable asset wasn't the patents, the luxury brand, or the massive casting machines. It was the human eye that was willing to notice a 4-degree difference between a $1 million failure and a world-changing success. She had been looking for a genius in a suit, but she had found one in a blue uniform, and all it had taken was the honesty of a little girl to show her exactly where to look. 6 months later, the Vieri Hyperion was officially in mass production. It had become the gold standard of the hypercar industry, praised by every trade journal from London to Tokyo for its unrivaled thermal stability and innovative airflow management. The company was no longer on the brink of collapse. It was expanding into 3 new international markets, and the stock price had tripled. Marco Bellini still arrived at the factory at 7 a.m. every morning. He still preferred the smell of cold steel and industrial oil to the scent of expensive cologne. But he no longer wore the anonymous blue coveralls of the forgotten man. He wore a clean, dark gray technician's uniform with a new title stitched in gold thread over his heart: Director of Practical Integration. The culture of the Vieri plant had changed fundamentally. The walls between the departments had been torn down. Every Friday, the design engineers were required to spend 4 hours on the assembly line, and the mechanics were invited to the design review meetings. The Vortex pitch was now a global patent, and Marco's name was listed first on the legal filing. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but when he spoke, the entire engineering department stopped talking. They had learned a multi-million-euro lesson, that the most important insights aren't always found in a lecture hall. Sometimes, they are found while holding a wrench at 3 in the morning. Julia returned to the factory on a warm Saturday afternoon. She walked past the rows of gleaming new cars, each one a testament to her father's vision. She saw the workers, men and women who now looked up and giggle, smile, when they saw her, calling her the chief inspector. She stopped at her father's new station, a bright, organized lab filled with high-tech flow testing equipment and a large table for hand-drawn schematics. Marco was hunched over a new prototype, a pencil behind his ear. "Did you build it, Dad?" Julia asked, touching the cold, polished steel of a finished engine. Marco laughed, a warm, rich sound that echoed through the bay. He picked his daughter up and set her on the edge of the workbench. "No, Julia, I didn't build it. I just helped it stay cool. Remember the rule? Everything works together." "I remember," she said, hugging him tight. The final image of the story is simple but profound. Alessandra Vieri stands on the high observation deck, looking down at the thriving production line. She sees Marco and Julia in the distance, the mechanic and the little girl who saved the company. She realizes that the most important question she ever asked wasn't, "Who designed this engine?" The important question was, "Who actually understands the machine?" The answer had saved her business, but it had also reminded her of a truth the world often forgets: that talent has no uniform, and that genius often hides in the people we choose not to see. As the massive hangar doors opened to let in the golden afternoon light, the engines hummed in perfect unison, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a world that was finally breathing properly. If you believe that real talent doesn't depend on job titles, only on who's paying attention, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments, have you ever been overlooked? How did you finally show the world what you could do